Today's tutorial is on a beautiful little piece that started off its life as one of Bach's Flute Sonatas and was subsequently transcribed for piano. It's called Siciliano, it's not massively difficult, and it's also a favourite with concert pianists as an encore type item. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Now there are two main transcriptions of this piece that I've come across. One of them is by Kempf, and you'll find a recording on YouTube of Lang playing this. And the other one is by Alkan, and that's the transcription I'll use today, simply because it's the one that I got with my copy of Pianist Magazine. Now, Pianist Magazine's pianist Chen-Yin Lee did a recording of this that I'll link below for you so you can listen to that afterwards. In any event, I'm sure whichever transcription you use, you'll find these practice ideas very helpful. As always, I'll use my 4-step method for learning new pieces, and I've created a full set of practice notes for you that you can download from the link in the description. So let's start with step 1, which is that of discover. Given that this started life as a flute sonata, then in fact it makes sense to first familiarise ourselves with the original. You'll find lots of versions on YouTube, as you might guess, and as you'll see, interpretations vary enormously. There are a wide variety of tempi, and the articulations in both the solo and accompaniments change frequently. Listen to these, following along with your piano score, and highlight those areas where there's interplay between the flute and the accompaniment. You'll notice in this area, for example, that there's a question-answer type motive between the two. Now listen to some piano versions of it using your chosen transcription. Listen to the differences in tempo again, differences in pedal dynamics and the like. There are a few general things that we should consider before starting work on this. And one of the first considerations here is that there are basically 3 lines. We have a melody, an accompaniment, and a bass line. Each of these naturally should sound distinct. The melody is always in the right, the bass always in the left. However, the 16th note accompaniment is often split between the hands. And if we look at these 2 examples, you can see the pattern of melody and accompaniment and bass is exactly the same, simply different chords. However, we can also see from the transcription that the split between the hands hasn't been done in the same way. Thus, I think the split isn't there for musical reasons, merely for ergonomic ones. Therefore, we can decide to split this however we wish. As we go through the tutorial, I'll show you what I do, but you might prefer to simply follow what suggestions are in the score, or even do something completely different. Incidentally, different editions seem to also have different distributions. Secondly is a question of pedal. My personal preference for this is to use quite a lot of pedal, certainly more than the score in Pianist Magazine suggests. I do this simply because I think the added resonance helps the melody, which after all was originally intended for a flute, and a flute can sustain notes much longer than a piano. If you listen to Lang's recording, you'll hear that he often uses lots of pedal, opting for less occasionally where there's not a sustained melody. Now let's divide this into sections. There are 3 of them, the first in G minor, the second in B flat major, and the last in G minor. For practice purposes, we'll then further split these sections into 1.5 or 2 measure snippets. So let's look in detail at this first snippet. And given that 80% of the piece follows this same basic pattern, it's worth putting in some additional effort here. We can see the bass note is marked with a tenuto and so needs additional emphasis. We can see that the 16th notes are split between the hands. However, this shouldn't actually be audible. Now we have a few options to start practicing this. This is part of my 3rd stage that I've conquered. The idea is that the more tricky we find something, the more ways we'll find to practice it. So here first, we can practice by omitting the 16th notes altogether. This helps us get a good feel for the melody and bass. Next, we can add in the 16th notes. We want to get these 16th notes equal, controlled and quieter than the rest. This can be easier said than done though when distributing them between the hands. So we can practice them in a couple of different ways first. We can also practice them firmly, so still equal and controlled, but louder. We can practice them staccato even. Then we can add the melody. Again, we can keep the accompaniment notes staccato, we can play them firmly, and we can finally aim to get them light. Now, exactly how long we spend doing this on just a single snippet largely depends. If you, for example, find you quickly get the separation you're aiming for, then there's no need to overdo this, is there? However, if you find that it's not so easy to control, then you might prefer to stick at it for a little longer. We can use this exact same process for every snippet that has a similar musical design, and there are lots of them throughout the piece. So initially, let's work on just the first two snippets. Practice each one independently in all of these different patterns to see how we get on. Another thing to watch for is awkward intervals. With a piece of music that is relatively slow, there really is nowhere to hide in terms of voicing. For smaller hands like mine, when I need to do an interval of a sixth between 2 and 5, for example, keeping 2 very light and 5 stronger isn't always very consistent. I also find that for some thirds, playing with a 4 and 5 doesn't give me the best control either. So therefore, as you practice, try to identify any intervals that you find harder to control. One option in such cases might be to redistribute that interval completely, taking the lower note with the left hand rather than the right. Where this isn't possible or would likely end up with a less reliable result, then isolate just a little fragment around that interval. Look closely at your hand position and experiment with different things. For the 6 phrase accompaniment in the second snippet, it might simply be a case of properly releasing the thumb on the lower 8 so that the pinky quickly moves towards the top 8. The next 2 snippets we can practice in exactly the same ways, and again, let's pay particular attention to the fingering. Towards the end of the third snippet, a good fingering for me was to use 4-2 on the B flat and F that leads very nicely down to 1 on the D. We also have the roll 10th that starts the 4th snippet. I found that rotating from the bottom to the top works well rather than jumping for it. I'm sure some of you won't even need to think about this anyway, as you can reach a 10th quite easily, of course. Now the final snippet is one of those examples of question and answer we looked at earlier. In the first measure, the scale passage in the right hand is played by the flute in the original. The left hand then echoes this in the following measure. Now you might think about using some degree of pedal therefore to mimic the flute in the first measure, and less or none perhaps in the echo, which has to be played by the keyboard. Perhaps now the final thing to mention about this section is that we have a descending scale that takes us into B flat major, and we want to ensure that the initial D in the left hand of the first snippet of the following section sounds as the conclusion of that scale. As you start getting these different snippets under control, think about integrating them. First, play just snippets 1 and 2 together. Practice also snippets 3 and 4 together. Then maybe 3, 4 and 5 together. And then finally start to join all 5 end to end. You can do this gradually over several days while starting to work on the second section, for example. As we now move into the second section, it's pretty much rinse and repeat at first. However, we do start to see a slightly different musical design where the accompaniment ceases to be arpeggios and moves into scales played against the melody. This can present a number of fingering challenges as these accompaniment notes are mostly taken with the right hand, so again, work snippet by snippet and practice each independently till you feel comfortable. Don't be afraid to change fingering if sometimes something isn't improving with practice. A good example of this in my case is in measures 18 and 19. I would intuitively have used 5 and 3 on the F and D. However, by using 5 and 4, it more easily gets me into position for the following 2-note chord with 1 and 3. The 6th snippet has more question and answer with the piano echoing the phrase first played by the flute. Try to make sure that these come out as separate melody lines as opposed to a melody and an accompaniment. Note also that the final snippet gives us a downward scale, taking us back into G minor, so let's ensure that that final G sounds. As I advised with the first section, start to integrate these snippets gradually. For our final section, it starts off the same as the first, so gives us some less work. However, it then borrows ideas from the second section to take us through to the ending. We have the same challenge around fingering here. Work carefully, snippet by snippet, deciding on fingering and distribution. Use the same practice methods as previously. Integrate it as well in exactly the same way. First, just a couple of snippets at a time, and then gradually longer sequences. We should now be at a stage where we can play all three sections independently, and it's now time for the final step of putting them together. However, try doing this first by practicing sections 1 and 2 together, and then only sections 2 and 3 together rather than all three at once. I think this helps based on the idea of a manageable mistake. After all, the shorter sections we practice, the less likely we are to make any mistakes, and as a result, the fewer there will be. If you find that you can rarely get through 2 sections at once without a few mistakes, then before moving on to 3, go back a stage and identify where those mistakes arise, and practice just those snippets plus the preceding one in isolation. Only as you start to feel confident playing 2 sections at a time, start trying to play all 3 of them together. I hope you'll find these practice tips handy and you'll enjoy learning this lovely little piece. And if you're interested in other pieces that have an accompaniment split between the hands, then the tutorial linked here is on the Mélodie by Gluck from the opera Orfeo and Eurydice. So if you're not already, please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.